Hi, students. So far so good for most of you. I realize some of us are still getting used to the rhythm of the online class for the summer. Um, I just wanted to say some things about section two. I believe that's what it is. In the inequality, part two, in the inequality reader. You guys are getting introduced to some of the concerns about inequality in the United States. And how it has detrimental effects on all kinds of things. My research is on understandings of poverty and that come from medical education. And so there's a lot written about inequality and its impact on health outcomes. So just to give you a little bit more from the example of healthcare, and just to talk a tiny bit about, until more information gets up about the essay Inequality, Too Much of a Good Thing. In that essay, Alan Kruger talks really about how theorists think that inequality on some level is a helpful incentive for productivity, to have people push to do better, as if that were all you had to do, right? So that's sort of the myth in the United States in particular, about if you just work hard enough, you get a certain education and you do certain things, that you will be successful. That just takes a lot of hard work. When in reality, some of us have more advantage over others, and those structures have been in place for a long time now, and they're very difficult. That stratification that's discussed in one of the essays is sort of hard to overcome. So just to give you an idea about some of the history even of social work, when social work was created, there was obviously the industrial age brought new opportunities for folks. And so social work was one of those spaces where women in particular had an opportunity to work outside of the home, have a salary that could where they could be financially independent. So if you think of when social work started, that was when women couldn't even vote. So there was less rights and say and even control over money for women at that time. So that in itself created a huge difference between men and women. And social work, nursing, other professions were really crucial in women gaining economic status and professional status. So just professions in general were created in part to sort of mess with the stratification system, by creating licenses and hoops to go through to warrant or to tell the community, well, I went through this special training or I went through this special education that means that I deserve to get paid more and to have higher power or more status. And so professions were created on some level as a way to go up the ladder. So we're a part of that. Of course, we've been a female-dominated profession, and so we have a very different level of status in our economic system than, say, medicine or law, which have been, up until now, predominantly male professions. Okay, so that's just to give you an idea, just in 100 years' time, how professionalism, licensure, higher education has helped, at least in creating opportunities for folks who wouldn't have otherwise had an opportunity. So that might be a positive of our current economic system, and as a result of industrialization, where the middle class has gotten larger. So in that time, there were more people who could actually afford an education, could afford particular ways of living. There's rules within the middle class that emphasize independence and progress, so always the newest thing, pushing for those kinds of things. So those attitudes within the middle class and those rules of middle class sort of continued to help keep middle class status where it is. Now, in the industrial age was also a time of incredible poverty, people moving from rural areas to industrial areas, and the work being more crowded, more dangerous, illness-wise, also injury-wise. They're big machines to hurt you. Also, just in terms of feelings towards work, everything was compartmentalized. People didn't feel as proud of their work as they maybe did when they were a craftsman or doing things in an agricultural setting. So a lot of isolation, feelings of isolation, alienation that come with the industrial age, but extreme poverty, so people working for very little and people making a lot of money. So there were sort of this incredible wealth of the people that owned sort of the industry, and this middle class that was becoming bigger and really pushing for change for the poor. So people like Jane Addams and those folks from the progressive era were very outraged by poverty, pushed for policies beside people that were poor to make things more equal. And at the time, really thinking that a democracy, as part of being a good citizen of a democracy, you always were pushing for more equality and not allowing for such huge disparities between the wealthy and the poor. And then the middle class also sort of this moral group, very angry at the greed on the wealthy side. So at the time, it was very active middle class, really grumpy about living conditions. So there are current sort of scholars who look at poverty and think that the free market will solve the poverty problem by just making sure that across the world there's this healthy middle class, that if every country in the world had a decent sized middle class, they would automatically demand that there be more equality. And so that's the thought, and it hasn't really worked out that way. And in the U.S., what we've been seeing since the 1970s is that the middle class has sort of stayed stagnant. Productivity has gone way up, so we're working super hard, but we're not getting paid the same way. So the middle class has been sort of squished and has less power, time, energy focused on pushing for equality, right? So the thought is that the U.S. is, sort of the example of what can happen if there's a healthy middle class. It's also an example of what can happen when that middle class is squished. So people that believe in the free market and are pushing for places like India and other parts of the world to have a larger middle class, it could result in just a lot of people across the world in this sort of oppressed space where they don't really have time. They are counted on to buy things, but not to really be politically active or put pressure on the wealthy to redistribute the wealth that's actually being made by lots of other people. Like the middle class and the poor, they're working really hard so those people can make less of money. Right. So, in terms of healthcare, the policies of the United States that have sort of caused social separation. So, elementary schools, even though they're desegregated, elementary schools are really based on neighborhood, and so real estate policies, and there's discriminatory policies that put us all in very different neighborhoods. So working class, the poor, the middle class, and the wealthy are all kept away from each other, and that's also divided by race, and even in terms of sexuality, which if you look at sort of how cities have been set up, there are certain places that are safer for people that are on the margins sexuality-wise. So those neighborhoods have become sort of isolated from others. So while we're all isolated off, we really don't understand each other. It's been a very effective way to keep folks from getting angry about inequality. And so the social determinants of health, so your level of education, your political power, access to transportation, access to healthy food, all of these things, so where you're located in the neighborhood and the resources that your neighborhood has really impact how well you're going to do mental health-wise and also physically. And even in neighborhoods where there are huge inequality, the health outcomes are bad for everybody. So not just people that are poor, but people that have some wealth if they're in a community where there's a lot of disparity. And with huge disparities comes a lot of discrimination, a lot of behaviors that make everyone feel awful. And the stress of that, the stress of inequality, and the discrimination that comes with that, those things have health impacts. So in countries where there's more equality, there is better health overall. People live longer, are less likely to have chronic illness, disability. They're also more likely to be happy as opposed to anxious and depressed. So inequality impacts all of us, and we're all in this sort of inequality muck together in the United States. So hopefully that gives you a little more insight into some of the chapters that you guys looked at, or essays that you looked at for week 2. Okay, bye.